They didn't scream when they were erased. They just stopped being needed. The chamber lights hummed at a steady frequency, soft and indifferent, casting long, sterile reflections across the polished steel floor as Ethan Cole adjusted the calibration dial with gloved fingers, watching the system respond in neat green bars across his wrist display, pressure stable, oxygen scrubbers online, temperature holding at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly as required for optimal processing conditions. Everything clean, efficient, quiet, the way the station liked it, the way the system demanded it, because nothing here was meant to feel personal, not even this, especially not this. And yet Ethan couldn't ignore the faint rhythm in the back of his mind, the awareness that behind the reinforced glass, they were still there, lined up in silent rows, motionless but not quite empty, not yet, waiting for the final confirmation that would move them from inactive to archived. A word that sounded cleaner than what it meant, a word that made it easier to keep working, easier to keep breathing, easier to keep pressing the buttons he was paid to press, because someone had to maintain the system, someone had to make sure it didn't fail, and Ethan had always been good at fixing things, even when he didn't fully understand why they were broken in the first place, even when no one asked him to question it. He just followed the readouts, trusted the process, kept his head down, until today. Because today the line didn't look the same, today something felt off, not in the machines, not in the numbers, but in the stillness itself, like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise perfect system. And when his eyes drifted toward the final unit at the far end of the row, he saw it, barely noticeable, a flicker, a breath, a shift so small it could have been dismissed as a sensor glitch, but Ethan had spent too many years reading broken signals to ignore it. He stepped closer, boots echoing softly against the floor, each step measured, controlled, like he could keep the moment contained if he moved slowly enough. And then he saw her, the blue tint of her skin dulled under the artificial light, the thin band around her wrist glowing faint red with the label everyone else had already accepted, defective, the letters clean, clinical, final, but her eyes were open, not fully, just enough to catch the light, just enough to reflect it back. And that was the problem. Defective units weren't supposed to look back. They weren't supposed to register anything at all. The system had cleared her already, categorized her, reduced her to a line of code waiting for closure, and yet here she was, breathing in shallow, uneven patterns, her chest rising just enough to disrupt the uniform stillness of the room. Ethan felt his hand hover near the console, the confirmation prompt blinking in front of him, awaiting input, a single command that would finalize the process, erase the anomaly, restore balance. It would take less than a second, less than the time it took to question it, and the system would return to normal. No errors, no flags, no consequences, just another completed cycle in a long list of quiet endings. But his finger didn't move, because the moment stretched longer than it should have, longer than the system allowed. And for the first time since he'd taken this job, Ethan Cole hesitated, not because he didn't know what to do, but because for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to do it. The prompt continued to blink, patient and unbothered, as if time itself had no weight inside the system. Confirm termination waiting in clean white text against a sterile blue background, while Ethan kept his hand suspended inches away, feeling the subtle vibration of the console beneath his fingertips, a reminder that everything here was still running exactly as designed, every circuit in place, every protocol intact, except for him, because he was the only variable that had not been accounted for, the only element capable of introducing error into a system that did not tolerate mistakes. And yet the longer he stood there, the more the silence shifted, no longer empty but expectant, like the room itself was watching to see what he would do. He exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, then reached past the confirmation key and tapped into the maintenance override panel instead, his access level just high enough to open a secondary diagnostic layer. Lines of code cascading across his display in tight structured columns, nothing out of place at first glance, nothing that justified the anomaly behind the glass. And yet the biometric feed attached to the final unit told a different story, faint but undeniable, a pulse, irregular but present, neural activity flickering like a weak signal fighting to stay online. She was not supposed to have that, not anymore. Not after classification, not after rejection, Defective units were stripped down to baseline functions before processing, reduced to near-zero variability. And yet she remained, not fully, not stable, but enough, just enough to exist. Ethan glanced toward the chamber again, this time stepping closer until the glass separated them by less than a foot. Her eyes shifted, barely, tracking movement with a delay that suggested exhaustion more than awareness. But it was still there, that response. That quiet refusal to disappear, and for reasons he could not explain, it unsettled him more than any system failure ever had. Because machines broke all the time. But this was not a machine problem. This was something else, something that did not belong in a report or a maintenance log, something that would not be fixed by replacing a component or recalibrating a sensor. His gaze dropped to the red band around her wrist. Defective, the word pulsing faintly, as if reinforcing itself with every second that passed. As if repetition could make it true. He had seen that label hundreds of times before, maybe thousands, and he had never questioned it, not once, because it was easier that way. Easier to trust the classification, easier to believe the system knew more than he did. But standing here now, watching the way her breathing struggled against the stillness, he felt something shift, not in the room, not in the code, but in himself, a small fracture in the certainty he had carried for years, the realization that maybe the system did not see everything. Maybe it did not understand what it was labeling. His display chimed softly, a new alert pushing through the interface. Timer extended. Beyond standard window, the system was noticing the delay, tracking his inactivity, calculating deviation from protocol. It would escalate if he waited too long. Supervisors would be notified, logs would be reviewed, and questions would follow. Questions he did not have answers for. Ethan swallowed, eyes flicking between the blinking confirmation prompt and the figure behind the glass. Two options, both simple, both irreversible. He could press the button, finish the cycle, restore order, or he could do something else, something that did not fit into any procedure he had ever been trained to follow. His hand moved again, slower this time. Not toward the confirmation key, but toward the system root access port. A decision forming not as a thought, but as an instinct, quiet and stubborn, the kind that did not ask permission, the kind that did not explain itself, the kind that simply acted. And as his fingers made contact with the interface, the hum of the chamber seemed to deepen, as if the station itself was aware that something had just gone wrong, or maybe, for the first time, something had just gone right. The system hesitated for exactly 0.3 seconds before responding. A delay so small, it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not spent years listening to machines breathe. But Ethan felt it, that tiny stutter in the rhythm of the station, like a heartbeat skipping under pressure, and then the interface shifted. The clean blue display fracturing into layered access panels as his override credentials pushed deeper than they were ever meant to go. Warning: unauthorized access. Flickered once, then dimmed, not gone but deprioritized, buried under maintenance authority that had not been updated in years. The kind of oversight that only mattered when someone decided to look too closely, and Ethan was counting on the fact that no one ever did. Not down here, not in a place designed to be forgotten. He moved quickly now, not rushed but precise. Fingers moving across the interface with practiced familiarity, isolating the unit's processing thread, rerouting system checks, masking the biometric anomaly under a loop of previously archived data. The code responded reluctantly, like it knew it was being bent, not broken, just enough to look the other way. And for the first time since he started this job, Ethan was not fixing the system. He was hiding something from it. The realization settled quietly in his chest, heavier than he expected, but he did not stop, because stopping would mean going back, and he had already gone too far for that. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as he disengaged the active cycle, a soft mechanical sigh echoing through the room as the processing sequence paused, not terminated, just waiting, suspended in a state the system did not fully understand. He stepped away from the console and moved toward the manual release panel, a physical interface rarely used, designed as a failsafe in case automation failed completely, which it never did. Until now, the handle was cold under his palm, untouched for years, maybe longer. And for a moment, he just stood there, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. Not because it was complicated, but because it was simple, one pull, and everything would change, Not just for her, but for him, for the logs, for the system that had never once expected him to choose anything other than compliance. His jaw tightened slightly. Then he pulled. The mechanism responded with a low hydraulic hiss, pressure equalizing as the chamber door unlocked with a muted click. The sound far too quiet for something that felt this loud. The glass panel shifted, sliding open just enough to break the seal. And the air changed, subtle but immediate, the sterile stillness replaced by a faint movement, a presence that had been contained now allowed to exist beyond its boundaries. Ethan stepped forward, cautious but steady, the distance between them closing until he stood just inside the threshold, close enough to see the fine details the glass had softened, the faint shimmer of her skin under the artificial light, the slight tremor in her breathing, the way her eyes struggled to focus, not on the room, not on the system, but on him, as if he was the only variable she could not process. He knelt slightly, lowering himself to her level without thinking about it, without questioning why. It just felt right, a quiet instinct overriding years of trained detachment. "You are not supposed to be awake," he said softly, the words more observation than accusation, more to himself than to her. Her gaze held his for a fraction longer than before, and then, with effort that showed in the smallest tightening of her expression, she spoke, her voice barely more than a breath, uneven, unfamiliar with sound. "Neither are you." The words landed with a weight that had nothing to do with volume, and for the first time, Ethan realized that whatever this was, whatever she was, it was not just a system error. It was something the system had tried to erase and failed, and now it was looking back at him, waiting to see what he would do next. The air outside the chamber felt heavier, not because of pressure, but because it was no longer controlled, no longer predictable, and Ethan noticed it immediately in the way her breathing changed, shallow before, now slightly deeper, uneven but adjusting, like her body was relearning something it had been denied. He stayed where he was, not reaching out, not rushing, just watching, because instinct told him that moving too fast might break whatever fragile balance had formed between them. The system behind him pulsed softly, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what had just happened, its indicators still running through silent checks, still expecting a completion that would never come. And for a moment, everything existed in that narrow space between action and consequence, suspended, uncertain, real. "Can you stand?" he asked quietly, the words simple, practical, the kind he would use for any damaged system he was trying to assess. But there was something different now, something that made the question feel less like a procedure and more like concern. Her eyes shifted slightly, focusing on him with more clarity than before, not fully steady, but no longer drifting. She did not answer immediately. Instead, her fingers twitched against the surface beneath her, testing, sensing, and then slowly, with visible effort, she tried to move. The motion was small, barely lifting her shoulder, but it was enough to show intent. Enough to show that she was not just present, she was trying. Ethan leaned forward just slightly, not touching, just close enough to steady if needed. "Do not force it," he said, softer now, more certain, because he recognized that look, not from machines, but from people who pushed too far too fast, the ones who broke not because they were weak, but because they did not know when to stop. She paused, her breathing tightening for a moment before settling again, and then she looked at him, really looked this time, as if evaluating something beyond the immediate, beyond the room, beyond the situation. "You altered the sequence," she said, her voice still faint but more stable, each word placed with careful precision, like she was choosing them rather than recalling them. Ethan let out a slow breath, not quite a sigh, more like an acknowledgement. "Yeah," he replied, simple, honest, no explanation offered, because there was not one that would make sense. Not even to him. She studied him for another second, longer this time, and then her gaze drifted past him toward the open chamber, toward the space where the others remained, still and silent, exactly as the system had left them. Her expression did not change much, but something in her eyes shifted, a quiet awareness, a recognition of what had been done, not just to her, but to all of them. "They will notice," she said, not as a warning, not as fear, just a fact, stated with the same calm clarity as everything else. Ethan nodded once, because he already knew that, had known it the moment he touched the override. The system always noticed eventually. It was built that way, designed to correct deviations, to restore order, to remove anything that did not belong, including him if necessary. Yeah, he said again, the word carrying a little more weight this time. They will. The silence that followed was different from before, not empty, not waiting, but shared, like both of them understood something without needing to say it. Time was moving again. The system would catch up, the logs would update, and when they did, there would be questions, and when there were questions, there would be consequences. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, glancing toward the console for just a second before looking back at her, making a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a continuation of what he had already started. We cannot stay here, he said, his voice steady now, grounded. This place is going to correct itself. She followed his gaze briefly, then returned it to him, and for the first time, there was something new in her expression. Not fear, not confusion, but something quieter, something closer to trust, or maybe just the absence of resistance. Then where do we go? She asked, and Ethan realized that for the first time since he had opened that door, the question was no longer about her survival. It was about both of them. He did not answer her right away because the truth was not a place. It was a risk, and Ethan had spent most of his life avoiding risks that did not come with clear instructions. But this one was already in motion, already unfolding around them whether he named it or not. He stood slowly, extending a hand without thinking, not as an order, not as a command, just an option. And she looked at it for a second like it was something unfamiliar, something not listed in any system she had been designed to understand. Then after a brief hesitation she reached out, her fingers colder than he expected, not fragile but unsteady. And when he helped her up the movement was uneven, her balance uncertain, but she stayed upright, leaning just slightly into his support before correcting herself, learning in real time, adapting in ways no defective unit was supposed to. Ethan released his grip carefully, watching her stabilize, then turned toward the console again, his mind already moving through pathways he had not used in years, maintenance routes, blind corridors, sections of the station that operated below primary surveillance, places designed for efficiency, not oversight. There is a service level, he said, his voice low, controlled, already shifting into the rhythm of planning. Below this floor, no active monitoring, just environmental systems and old storage bays. He paused, glancing at the main display as a soft alert flickered across the screen. System review initiated. It had started, slower than he expected, but inevitable. It will buy us time, he added, not looking at her this time, because saying it out loud made it real, made it something he was responsible for. She stepped closer, her movements still measured but more certain than before, following his gaze to the console, processing the information in her own way. Time for what? She asked, and it was not skepticism, not doubt, just a genuine need to understand the objective. Ethan hesitated for half a second, because that was the part he did not have. Not yet. I do not know, he admitted, and there was something strange about saying that, something unfamiliar, because he was used to knowing exactly what came next, used to systems that defined outcomes before actions were even taken. But this was different. This was undefined, open, uncertain, and yet he did not step back from it. But staying here is not an option, he finished, more certain now. She watched him for a moment, longer than necessary, as if measuring the weight of his words against something internal, something not visible. Then she nodded once, a small, precise movement that carried more agreement than any verbal response could. And that was enough. Ethan moved quickly after that, not rushed but efficient, his hands working through the console to finalize the override mask, looping the chamber feed, freezing the last valid frame before the anomaly, creating the illusion of completion without the actual process. It would not hold forever, but it did not need to, just long enough to disappear. The system responded with quiet compliance, unaware of the deception layered into its own logic, and when he was done, he stepped back, scanning the room one last time, committing it to memory without meaning to. The rows, the lights, the silence, the place where everything had followed the rules until he decided not to. We go now, he said, turning toward the side access door, his voice steady, grounded in action rather than thought. She followed without question, her steps still soft, but no longer hesitant, and as the door slid open with a muted hiss, revealing the dimly lit maintenance corridor beyond, Ethan felt something shift again, not in the system, not in the station, but in the space between them, something quiet, something unspoken, a connection not built on logic or design, but on a single shared decision to walk away from what they were told they had to be. And for the first time since this started, he did not look back. The maintenance corridor swallowed the light behind them as the door sealed with a soft click, leaving only a narrow strip of dim overhead panels flickering at irregular intervals. The kind of lighting designed for machines, not people, cold and efficient, stretching into a long passage that seemed to hum with forgotten purpose. Ethan moved first, his pace steady but measured, boots landing with controlled quiet against the metal grating, each step guided by memory rather than sight, because he had walked these corridors before, years ago, when he still believed that knowing every part of the station made him valuable. Now it just made him responsible. He glanced back once, just enough to make sure she was still there, and she was, following at a slight distance, her movements more stable than before, but still deliberate, like she was learning how to exist outside of predefined limits, her gaze moving across the walls, the exposed conduits, the low-hanging cables, taking in everything. Without asking, without reacting, just observing. Watch the floor, Ethan said quietly, nodding toward a section where the plating dipped slightly, a maintenance gap that had never been fully repaired. She adjusted her step without hesitation, adapting immediately. And that was the part that stayed with him, not the weakness he had expected, but the speed at which she compensated for it. Like she was not broken at all, just different. The thought lingered as they moved deeper into the corridor, the ambient noise shifting around them, the distant pulse of the main systems fading into a lower frequency hum, something older, less refined, the sound of infrastructure that kept everything running without ever being seen. Ethan slowed near an intersection where 3 identical passages split off, each one marked only by faded maintenance codes stenciled along the walls. He paused, scanning the markings, not because he did not know the way, but because he needed to be sure, needed to eliminate even the smallest chance of error. This way, he said finally, turning left into a narrower passage where the lights dimmed even further, forcing his eyes to adjust. The air cooler here, closer to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature dropped subtle but noticeable, designed to preserve equipment rather than comfort. Behind him, her footsteps softened, matching his pace more closely now, less distance between them, not quite beside him, but no longer trailing, a shift that did not go unnoticed. "Why did you stop?" she asked after a moment, her voice clearer now, still quiet, but no longer fragile. The question simple, direct. Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not have one, but because the answer did not fit into a clean explanation. "Because you were not supposed to be alive," he said eventually. The words straightforward, stripped of anything unnecessary. He did not look back when he said it, just kept moving, trusting that she would follow, trusting that she understood more than she let on. There was a brief silence after that, not empty, just processing. And then, "That is not a reason," she replied, not challenging, just stating. Ethan let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "It is the only one I have," he said, and for a second, that felt like enough. They reached a reinforced hatch at the end of the corridor, older than the rest of the structure, its surface marked with wear that spoke of years of neglect. Ethan stepped forward, entering a manual code into the side panel, the interface slow to respond, outdated, but still functional. After a moment, the lock disengaged with a dull mechanical click, and the door slid open just enough to reveal the space beyond, a storage bay, wide and dim, filled with unused equipment and silent machines stacked in orderly rows, untouched, unmonitored, forgotten, exactly what he needed. He stepped inside, then turned slightly, giving her room to enter first, not out of habit, not out of protocol, but something else. Something quieter, something human, and as she crossed the threshold, the door closed behind them, sealing them off from the system that had tried to erase her, and the one that was now quietly trying to find them. The storage bay did not welcome them. It simply allowed them to exist, rows of silent machinery standing like forgotten witnesses under low amber lights that flickered with no urgency to stay alive. The air still, cooler than before, hovering just under 60 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying the faint metallic scent of long-unused systems. Ethan stepped forward slowly, scanning the space with a practiced eye, not for danger, but for function, for anything that still worked, because in a place like this, survival depended less on hiding and more on what you could keep running. Behind him, she moved with more confidence now, her steps quieter, more controlled, no longer testing each motion but beginning to trust it. And yet her gaze remained active, shifting across the room, cataloging, learning, not like a machine processing data, but like someone trying to understand a world they had never been meant to see. Ethan stopped near a stack of inactive equipment units, rectangular frames. Covered in dust, their interfaces dark but intact. He reached out, brushing a layer of fine particles aside with the back of his hand, revealing a small access panel beneath. "These still have power reserves," he said, more to himself than to her, kneeling down as he pried the panel open with careful precision. The internal systems responded with a faint hum as he connected a manual override cable from his wrist unit. The display flickered once, then stabilized, a soft green glow returning to life. "Minimal, but enough. It will give us a controlled environment," he added, adjusting the output levels to stabilize temperature and air quality within a small radius, not the entire bay, just a pocket, a space where her condition would not deteriorate. Because even if she was adapting, he did not know the limits of that adaptation, and he was not willing to test them. She stepped closer, watching the process with quiet focus, her head tilting slightly as the system came online. "You repair things," she said, not as a question, but as a conclusion drawn from observation. Ethan gave a small nod, not looking up from his work. "That is the job," he replied, simple, factual, as the stabilizer field activated with a low-frequency pulse, barely noticeable but present, the air around them shifting just enough to feel different, more balanced, more livable. He stood then, turning to face her fully for the first time since they entered the bay, taking in the details he had not allowed himself to focus on before. The way her posture had improved, the steadiness in her breathing, the clarity returning to her eyes. She was not just surviving, she was recovering, and that realization carried weight, because it meant the system had been wrong, completely, not partially, not by error margin, but fundamentally. "You are stabilizing," he said, the words measured, cautious, like he was confirming a system readout he did not fully trust yet. She looked down at her own hands. For a moment, flexing her fingers slowly, testing control, then lifted her gaze back to him. "I am adjusting," she replied, the distinction subtle but important, and Ethan noticed it, the difference between being fixed and choosing to adapt. One was passive, the other intentional, and that difference mattered more than he expected. A faint tone echoed through the bay, distant but distinct, not from the equipment around them, but from the station itself, a system-wide signal filtering down through layers of infrastructure. Ethan froze for a fraction of a second, recognizing it immediately. Not an alarm, not yet, but close. System review escalated. The process was moving faster now, narrowing its search parameters, correcting discrepancies. "They are getting closer," he said quietly, more to the situation than to her, his mind already shifting again, recalculating, adjusting. Because time was no longer a resource they could manage, it was something they were losing. She did not react with fear, did not step back or hesitate. Instead, she moved slightly forward, closing the space between them by just a few inches, enough to be felt, not enough to be obvious. "Then we move again," she said, her voice steady, clearer than it had been before. And in that moment, Ethan realized something he had not considered when he first opened that chamber. This was no longer a rescue. It was a partnership, not equal, not yet, but forming, evolving, built not on design or instruction, but on a shared refusal to be defined by a system that had already decided they did not belong. And as the distant hum of the station deepened around them, Ethan nodded once, not because he had a plan, but because he understood the direction, and for now, that was enough. The tone deepened into a steady pulse that seemed to come from everywhere at once, not loud, not urgent, but persistent, A reminder that the system had shifted from observation to correction. Ethan shut down the portable stabilizer with a quick sequence, cutting the soft green glow before it could mark their position any longer. The air returned to its cooler baseline, just under 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and he felt the change in the way his breath moved. Thinner, sharper, real. We move through the relay spine, he said, already turning toward the far wall where a narrow access seemed cut through stacked equipment, hidden in plain sight. A maintenance shortcut used during early construction. Long before the station relied on full automation, he pried the panel open with a controlled twist, revealing a tight passage lined with fiber conduits and data trunks humming with low voltage. Single file, he added, stepping in and angling his shoulders to fit, the space barely 24 inches wide, forcing a slower pace, forcing silence. Behind him she followed without hesitation, her movements precise now, matching his rhythm as if she had learned it in minutes rather than years. The conduits cast thin bands of light across her blue skin as they passed, flickers of pale color reflecting off polished insulation, like the system itself was trying to read her and failing to find a category. Ethan kept his eyes forward, counting turns by memory, right at the split, left at the junction marked with faded white stenciling, each decision guided by instinct layered over years of maintenance routes. The hum around them shifted again. Higher frequency now, closer to active monitoring channels. He slowed and raised a hand slightly, a silent signal. They paused, listening, not to footsteps or voices, but to patterns in the noise, the way the station breathed when it was searching, scan sweep. He whispered, more breath than sound, and waited, 3 seconds, then 5. Then the faint ripple passed overhead like a soft pressure change, non-invasive, not designed to feel. But he felt it anyway, a brush of attention that moved on. Without stopping, he exhaled quietly and moved again, faster now, because windows like that did not stay open. You sense it, she said behind him, her voice steady even in the confined space. Not a question, a recognition. Ethan nodded once though she could not see it. You learn the rhythm, he replied, keeping his voice low. Systems have habits. There was a brief silence, then, so do people, she said, and the words settled between them with a quiet weight, not challenging, just present. They reached the end of the conduit spine where it opened into a narrow service balcony overlooking a larger chamber. The lights here were brighter, functional, rows of processors stacked in vertical columns stretching nearly 20 feet high, each unit blinking in synchronized patterns. The core of the station's decision engine. Ethan crouched at the edge, scanning the floor below. No personnel, just autonomous carts gliding along preset paths, carrying components from one station to another. Predictable, timed, useful. He pointed to a maintenance ladder descending along the far side. Down, then across to the transport rails, he said, mapping the route in his head as he spoke it. We can ride a service carrier to the outer ring, less monitoring there. He glanced back at her for a fraction of a second, enough to confirm she was ready, and saw something different again, not just steadiness, but intent, a quiet alignment with the path forward. If they find us, she said, not slowing, not hesitating, I will return. Ethan shook his head immediately, sharper than he intended. No. The word came out firm, grounded. We do not trade one error for another. She held his gaze for a moment, measuring the certainty in it, then gave a small nod, not agreement to the idea, but to him. And that was enough. Ethan turned back to the ladder and began the descent, hands steady on the rungs, boots finding each step without looking. Below them the system continued its silent work, unaware that two variables were moving through its logic without permission, not hidden perfectly, not invisible, just human enough to choose. And as they reached the floor and stepped into the moving rhythm of machines, Ethan realized the plan was no longer just to escape. It was to stay unclassified, to exist without a label, and for the first time, that felt possible. The service carrier moved with a low mechanical glide, its path locked into the station's internal schedule, indifferent to who stood on it or why. Ethan kept his posture neutral, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward, matching the rhythm of the automated carts that passed on either side, each one following its own line of logic. none of them questioning the presence of two figures moving just slightly out of place. Beside him, she stood steady, no longer leaning, no longer adjusting every step. Her balance fully her own now, her breathing even. Her gaze fixed ahead as if she had already accepted whatever came next. The outer ring came into view slowly, the lighting dimmer, the architecture less refined, a place where efficiency gave way to neglect, fewer sensors, fewer updates, fewer corrections. Exactly as Ethan had said, the carrier slowed as it approached a junction node, its route branching into multiple paths. And then it stopped, a soft chime indicating the end of its assigned cycle. They stepped off together without hesitation, their movements synchronized in a way that had not been planned, just learned. The space around them quieter now, the distant hum of the central systems reduced to a low background pulse, like the station itself was losing interest, or maybe just losing track. Ethan moved toward a terminal embedded in the wall, older than the others, its interface dim but responsive. He connected his wrist unit, pulling up the station's external routing grid, a web of pathways leading beyond the controlled environment, beyond the reach of internal classification. There is a maintenance shuttle, he said, scanning the data, his voice calm, focused, low priority, used for outer hull inspections. It is scheduled to cycle in 12 minutes. He paused, verifying the route, confirming the absence of active tracking on that channel. If we reach it, we can leave the network. The words hung there for a moment, not heavy, not dramatic, just factual, and yet they carried more weight than anything he had said before, because this was not just movement. This was departure. She stepped closer to the terminal, her reflection faint in the dark screen as she studied the shifting lines of data. Leave. She repeated softly, as if testing the word, not for meaning, but for possibility. Ethan glanced at her, just briefly, enough to see the way her expression had changed again. Not uncertainty, not hesitation, but something quieter, something deeper. You do not have to come, he said. The sentence simple, unforced, because he understood now that whatever she chose next would not be dictated by him, not by the system, not by anything except her own decision. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze fully, and for the first time since he had opened that chamber door, there was no distance in it, no separation between observation and connection, just clarity. I was designed to follow a sequence, she said, her voice steady, grounded. But I chose not to end it. She let that settle for a second, then added, that was the first choice. Her eyes did not leave his. This is the second. She reached out, not hesitantly, not uncertainly, but with quiet intent, her hand stopping just short of his, not touching, just there, present, real, and Ethan did not hesitate this time. He closed the distance, not by much, just enough for their hands to meet, not a gesture of control, not of rescue, but of agreement. The terminal chimed softly, a notification scrolling across the screen. System update. Defect criteria refined. Ethan's eyes flicked to the text for a fraction of a second, reading the line that followed. Emotional deviation detected, and for a moment, he almost smiled. Not because it was ironic, not because it was wrong, but because for the first time, the system had come close to understanding what it could not control. He disconnected the interface, the screen fading back into darkness as the station continued its quiet corrections, still searching, still adjusting, still trying to define what did not fit. Ethan looked back at her, then toward the distant docking bay where the shuttle would arrive. 12 minutes, not a long time, but enough. Ready? He asked, not as a command, not as a test, just a simple check. She gave a small nod, her grip steady, her presence certain, and together they turned toward the exit, not running, not hiding, just moving forward, leaving behind a system that had tried to reduce them to a label and carrying with them something it could never fully process, a choice, quiet, human, and entirely their own.